The future of Australia's steelworks remains in the spotlight, with both state and federal governments pledging a multi-billion-dollar support package after Whyalla Steelworks was thrust into administration last week. Part of the Green Iron Investment Fund on this package has been allocated to transition to green steel production. With the region manufacturing around 75% of the country's steel, how could these changes support a transition to green metal? And why is it important to maintain domestic steel production? I spoke with Dr. Daniel Rossetto, adjunct at the Institute of Sustainability, Energy and Resources at the University of Adelaide.
Well, I think the ambition of sovereign steel production needs to be analysed a little bit further. I think what we're really talking about here is making sure that our defence industries do not rely on other countries for the steel that is needed as an input. That's a really important goal. In that respect, Whyalla and also Port Kembla, being the two largest steel production plants in Australia, are particularly important. So I think the sovereign capability question is really about ensuring that Australia does not rely on other countries for the steel that is needed for its defence.
So they can access it domestically.
Correct.
With such huge state and federal financial contribution, what does it now mean that taxpayer dollars are invested in a privately owned company, or what do you believe this should mean, especially when it comes to accessing domestically manufactured steel?
Putting aside the question of sovereign capabilities, the general practice of giving billions of dollars of subsidies to private sector firms is often fraught with difficulty, and subsidies, whilst they might sound interesting, don't necessarily encourage the companies to be as competitive as possible. So in the longer term, it is in Australia's best interest to have a competitive domestic steel production industry, and relying too much on subsidies, especially if the subsidies are repeated in the future, is or can become a significant problem for the firms that are relying on those subsidies.
How do you see this investment contributing to the prospective transition of green steel manufacturing, or creating a pathway to green metals? And what could that mean in terms of Australia's targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, I think the first and foremost issue here is that the green steel discussion has probably got a couple of steps ahead of where the actual market for steel is globally and also in Australia. So green steel is a concept that people talk about, it gets a lot of airtime, but it's not necessarily something that is demonstrably leading to more value in the steel markets. For example, it's quite difficult to find any evidence globally that firms in the steel market are prepared to pay more for green steel. So I think that needs to be recognised from the outset. There's also a lot of confusion about exactly what green steel is, and in principle it is steel that adopts environmentally, socially and economically responsible practices in its production.
Obviously, there's a lot of talk about green steel, but if
Mhm.
we're steps ahead of what it actually looks like, or
Yes.
steps ahead of international markets, if this were to transpire or become a pathway for green metals, could it have the capacity to reshape Australia's position in a global market?
I mean, there are various pathways to producing green steel, one of which is, I'll call it the more straightforward path, which is to actually utilise electric arc furnace technology to recycle steel, to use scrap steel and essentially recycle steel. And that is a process which is used commonly in countries like the United States to great effect. It reduces emissions quite a lot. That's a really robust technology, and I think there's a few proposals, at least in Australia, to do more of that. The kind of green steel that's being discussed for Whyalla is a reasonably more elaborate process whereby eventually green hydrogen was to be used to take the place of metallurgical coal in the reduction of iron. And that implies that the green steel would still continue to use Australian iron ore in Australia and would then eventually target the ability to compete in the supply of steel in international markets. Now, that's a very, very ambitious plan, and it's not a plan that comes without consequences. And one of the most important consequences that I don't think everybody in Australia necessarily realises is that it's basically signalling to international buyers of Australia's iron ore that Australia one day hopes to be competing with it in the production of steel in global markets.
Dr. Daniel Rosetto from the University of Adelaide speaking with me there.